All right, so friend of the show, Kyle Kalinsky, recently had on the intellectual giant of the right, Jordan Peterson, on his Crystal Kyle and Friends podcast, which I actually made an appearance on about a month ago, if you guys want to go check that out. But nonetheless, they got into a bunch of different topics during this, and it got pretty heated, to say the least, at certain parts throughout this. So I'm probably going to do a number of different videos breaking down different clips from this podcast. But this one, I wanted to focus in on Jordan Peterson's view of Elliot Page, who is a recently transitioned actor, and his views on the trans community more broadly. So we're going to go through this clip and I'll give you guys my reaction to it here in a minute. But basically, just to set up the precursor to why they're talking about this issue, basically Elliot Page is a trans male actor who recently transitioned and basically just wants basic acceptance for how they identify, and Jordan Peterson just was not having it. He basically came out on Twitter, actually got banned for a tweet that I'm about to read to you guys right here, and then we're going to get into some of the absolutely hilarious responses that he had in a 14-minute long video that he published, basically crying about the fact that he got removed or suspended from Twitter in response to this tweet. So here, first of all, to start us off, we have the actual tweet in question. They say on June 22nd, 2022, Jordan Peterson made a tweet that read, "Remember when pride was a sin, and Ellen Page just had her breasts removed by a criminal physician." So obviously, number one, he is dead naming Elliot Page intentionally, and on top of that, suggesting that the person who performed the transition surgery on Elliot Page was a criminal. So obviously, you can see, potentially some of the reasons why he would get removed from Twitter for this type of a tweet, but they give a little bit of context here, saying prior to coming out to the world as Elliot, he went by Ellen, and following this tweet, Jordan was warned by Twitter and asked to remove the content. The tweet violated the guidelines of Twitter, as it was noted that the statement may promote, threaten, or harass people on the basis of sexual orientation, gender, or gender identity. So, I mean, in terms of the Twitter terms of service, which many people could have valid arguments around the parameters of the Twitter terms of service, or whether or not Twitter should, as a private company, even have the right to have the types of terms of service that they have right now. Regardless, given the outline that they have right here, it clearly falls under the purview of harassing people on the basis of gender identity. So I think that part is pretty transparently obvious. He's, calling him by his dead name here, as well as suggesting that it was a criminal physician, obviously targeting one single person for really no fucking reason whatsoever. But nonetheless, obviously, I think it was somewhat justified, at least under the purview of the Twitter TOS, that he would get removed from Twitter for that tweet. And again, just as a reminder, the only way that he had, or the only thing that he would have had to do to get back on Twitter was literally just delete that one specific tweet. And he came out and said that he would rather die than remove the tweet about Elliot Page. So just completely fucking ridiculous. But we even had some better clips here from the video that he posted. So some of the ones that I thought were hilarious here. Let's start off with this one.
If I am required to acknowledge that my tweet violated the Twitter rules. What rules, you sons of bitches?
Okay, so I just thought that part was fucking hilarious, but obviously, I mean, he's sitting in a chair. He's, has multiple different camera angles focused in on him. He's wearing a, suit for this event, as if it's a very serious issue that he's talking about here, getting banned for just doing, run-of-the-mill transphobia on his Twitter account. But that was just one of the clips that we had. We also had this one, which people were roasting.
Up yours, woke moralists. We'll see who cancels who.
Okay, so, I mean, listen, he's staring into the camera, taking himself seriously as he says, "Up yours, woke moralists. We'll see who cancels who." So, again, I'm not really sure how people could take this guy seriously, or, think that he is some sort of a serious political commentator or intellectual figure on the right. But nonetheless, this is who Jordan Peterson is, shitting and pissing his pants over the idea that he would get removed or suspended from Twitter over a blatantly transphobic tweet that very clearly broke their terms of service rules. So with that being laid out here, let's go ahead and jump into the actual clip of him having some degree of pushback from Kyle Kalinsky, because this is, absolutely wild in terms of how many different things that Jordan got wrong in this clip, statistically and factually, but also just how he views this issue as a whole is, at least in my opinion, absolutely psychotic. So let's go ahead and jump into this.
So I noticed just the other day you were banned from Twitter. Now, I'm somebody, nobody can argue against my lefty credentials. Everybody knows I'm a man of the left. Having said that, my solution on this issue of social media censorship has always been, look, we need to expand First Amendment protections. And the way you do that is to regulate these big social media companies like they're public utilities. So if you do that, then basically you're saying this is the new public square and people can speak their mind here. Now that doesn't mean, of course you can't, dox people or do direct threats of violence or anything that's actually illegal will remain illegal. But outside of that, you can't censor people just based on political opinion. So, I definitely wouldn't have banned you, suspended you, etc. But I do have a question about that specific tweet that did get you in trouble because, you said something to the effect of...
well, I don't know if it got me in trouble. I don't think I'm in trouble. Twitter banned me, but I don't consider that trouble.
That's fair enough. Fair point. But
doesn't consider it trouble, but he's going out and making a 14-minute video where he's shitting and pissing and crying his pants over the fact that he got removed from Twitter. Okay.
But you said something to the effect of, remember when pride was a sin, and the criminal physician...
And Ellen Page just had her breasts cut off by a criminal physician.
Criminal physician, exactly. So my question is the physician really criminal? If you agree that adults can decide to transition, then why would the physician be criminal? Don't adults have that right if they want to transition?
Not everything legal isn't criminal. And do they have that right? See, I would have left Ellen Page alone if she hadn't been parading her new abs in a fashion magazine.
What are you talking about, dude? So, okay, basically his point here is he doesn't really have any explanation for why the criminal should be thought of as, or why the physician should be thought of as criminal. But on top of that, he's saying, I wouldn't have gone after Elliot Page if it had not been for them posting, a picture in a magazine of them flexing their abs or whatever the fuck that they were doing at that time. I mean, what are you really saying? You're saying that you're okay, maybe hypothetically, with grown adults making these decisions in terms of how they want to identify and present themselves to the world. You're saying maybe in a hypothetical scenario, I would support that, but just as long as those trans people then remove themselves from the public sphere, that they don't present themselves to the public in any way, shape, or form. I mean, what the fuck is the underlying sentiment of what he's implying here by saying that the reason he went out and did this transphobic attack against Elliot Page was because he was on a magazine cover? I mean, just completely fucking ridiculous.
How many kids do you think she can convince to convert? 1?
Yeah.
1,000? No, not yeah.
No,
really.
I want to respond to that. I think that
convinced to convert. Okay, again, employing the same type of language that we heard back when being gay or lesbian was much less acceptable in the United States, as if being gay or lesbian or trans is simply something that you're taught from a young age instead of being something that is intrinsic to who you are as a person. I mean, he has a completely backwards understanding of what it means to be LGBTQ, but Kyle pushes back here a little bit.
With the trans community, it's very similar to the gay community, where back when that first became a big issue, people thought, oh, if we talk about it, if it's in magazines or whatever, we're promoting kids to go down that path. But really what happened is people are who they are. And if they're gay, they just decided to be yeah, I'm gay. And they were just more open and honest with themselves. So I don't think you're promoting people to do that.
No,
you're
that's
just
not
saying,
what happened.
if you
You're
are that, it's okay.
wrong.
Okay, well,
you're utterly
I'm
wrong.
listening.
There's nothing about that that's right.
So explain.
Well, there's been an absolute... Look, one of the reasons that I opposed Bill C-16 in Canada to begin with, this pronoun compelled speech bill, was because I knew perfectly well what was going to happen when we introduced confusion about gender identity into the public sphere. Now, the argument was that if we left people with gender dysphoria alone...
Okay, keep in mind, the idea that there has been quote-unquote confusion about gender identity, there have been trans people throughout all of human history. This is not a new phenomenon. This didn't just get invented in the 2000s, okay? This is something that has existed for the entirety of humanity as we have recorded history, okay? So the idea that this is something new that is being sprung upon society is absolutely fucking delusional and, ridiculous framing here by Jordan Peterson.
...alone to make their own way and stop torturing them, that we would decrease the mental health load on those individuals. And my analysis as a clinician was that for every one person of that sort that we hypothetically save, we doom 1,000 more as a consequence of confusion and social contagion.
Okay, do you understand what he's saying here? He's saying that even though all of the statistics that we have at our disposal right now bear out the reality that if trans people are more accepted within broader society, but also more specifically within their own households, having one or two parents who are accepting of your gender identity or your sexuality in the case of gay or lesbian people or bisexual people as well, we know for a fact, based on the statistical data right now, that having that presence within your home or within broader society significantly lowers the risk of suicide within these communities, okay? That is 100% a fact. And basically what he's trying to imply here is that there is a 1 to 1,000 ratio of people within these communities that would be less likely to commit suicide or self-harm versus the amount of people who would be spreading this to, or the amount of people who would be become trans or gay or lesbian as a result of seeing this phenomenon within society. That's fucking insane. A 1 to 1,000 ratio of saving people's lives versus spreading this as if it's some sort of a disease upon society.
I knew the literature on psychogenic epidemics. They used to call that mass hysteria, and it's a literature that goes back about 300 years. And whenever you introduce, often when you introduce social confusion, you can produce a psychogenic epidemic, especially among, generally it's adolescent females who are most susceptible to it. So I thought, oh, well, what's going to happen is we'll produce a psychogenic epidemic of gender dysphoria among adolescent females. And that is exactly what's happened. And it isn't the fact that...
Do you have any data? Do you have any statistical analysis to prove that it was a psychogenic mass hysteria event that has led to more people over time as society and social forces progress, that more people are identifying as members of the LGBTQ community? Do you have any evidence whatsoever to suggest that that is a social contagion versus something that being more acceptable by society and something that is less criminalized and people having the freedom to go identify as, you know, how they want to identify? I mean, completely backwards reasoning here, but just to give you guys a reminder on one of the best comparisons for a situation like this and pushing back against this type of rhetoric from somebody like Jordan Peterson, or any transphobe for that matter. So the history of left-handedness, this is a graph that people often point out to make a comparison here. So as you can see here, you have the social phenomenon back in like the 1800s, early 1900s, where being left-handed, according to like the religious right within the United States, it was deemed to be something that was satanic. It was deemed to be demonic if you were left-handed, and so it was significantly and forcefully suppressed within the United States as a phenomenon. And you can see here that it very significantly trails down to like less than 4% in the early 1900s. Then, as that social phenomenon of forcefully repressing the fact that people are left-handed, as that starts to fade away, you see an uptick in people who are identifying the fact that they are intrinsically left-handed, that they are inherently left-handed. And so you see that start to tick up, and then eventually it levels off, and we see like a roughly 12% natural rate of people who are left-handed within the United States. Okay, so this is the same general concept with the gay community, the lesbian community, the trans community as well. Of course, as it becomes more socially acceptable, you are going to see an uptick in people who feel the freedom, the ability to go and publicly announce or publicly identify with their gender or their various sexualities. So, I mean, basically under Jordan Peterson's understanding of this type of an issue surrounding the LGBTQ community, if this was applied to something like left-handedness, his explanation for this uptick in people who are left-handed was that it was some sort of a socially enforced phenomenon, or a mass hysteria phenomenon, where people are just being tricked into thinking that they're left-handed when they're actually right-handed naturally. I mean, just completely fucking ridiculous. But you can see here with a graph like this how absolutely insane that type of an argument is.
We've freed up people who are, in doubt about their identity to be who they are. That may have happened in a tiny minority of cases. It's absolutely and definitely the case that we've doomed thousands of kids to brutal, mutilating surgery and premature sterility. And we've done that on the altar of our hypothetical moral virtue and compassion.
Notice the language that he chooses to use in a situation like this, calling it mutilating surgery. Would you call it mutilating surgery when somebody has open heart surgery and their life is saved? I mean, you could do this for literally any medical procedure that exists, okay? All medical procedures are going to be somewhat gruesome, okay? Because it's a fucking medical procedure where you are having, parts of your body opened up or, altered in some way. I mean, would he say the same thing about cis women getting a boob job or something like that, or breast augmentation? Would he say the same thing, that it's mutilating and horrific surgery that's being done? No, he wouldn't say that. I mean, it's just, completely ridiculous way of disingenuously using violent rhetoric in this circumstance to make it seem as though it's something that it's not.
Look, I read a corporate analysis of the trans surgery industry last week. Growth rate projection for you lefty types and your anti-corporatism. Growth rate projection, 15% per year. Invest now. A $350 million business as of 2022. Projected to expand to $750 million by 2027. No moral hazard there?
No, of course there's a moral hazard there, as the same as there is a moral hazard in the entirety of our for-profit health insurance and big pharmaceutical enterprises within the United States. I mean, leftists, socialists, especially me, and I know that Kyle Kalinsky has the same critique as me, is that we don't think that the profit motive should exist at all within a healthcare system, whether it's on trans-affirming care or whether it's on insulin production or whether it's on, basic healthcare services, no matter what it is, okay? We believe in decommodifying healthcare. So the idea that Jordan Peterson, in this one specific instance, would bring up the profits of corporations who are exploiting this moment to profit off of trans-affirming care, it's completely disingenuous because we are against the profiting of any types of healthcare across the board. So again, ridiculous framing here.
There's plenty of moral hazard there. And that surgery is absolutely brutal.
So what percentage of the population do you think, in your conception of how this is unfolding, what percentage of the population do you think is going to end up being trans at the end of this? Do you think one day it's going to be like 70% of the country is trans?
Well, we know already that about 1 in 5 adolescents now identifies, to use that hated word, identifies as part of the hypothetical LGBTQ plus community.
Okay, already, that was not the question that Kyle Kalinsky just asked. He just asked you straight up, what percentage of the broader public do you think eventually is going to become trans? And his response to that was to say that in younger generations, we are seeing roughly 1 in 5 people identify with the much broader label of LGBTQ, which could be lesbian, it could be gay, it could be bisexual, it could be pansexual, it could be asexual, it could be any number of different things, including being trans. But that 20% figure that he's citing here is not the fucking question that Kyle was just asking there.
So it's 1 in 5. I don't know what the upper limit is. There's a consulting group in the UK now that's claiming there's 150 different genders. There's actually, I suppose, 7 billion different genders if you want to get technical about it, because everybody's temperament differs. But I don't know what the upper limit is, and I have no idea what the upper limit is for this surgical intervention. We'll see. But I don't find it. I don't find it the least bit acceptable. And if you think that your compassion is demanding that you extend your pity to the LGBTQ plus community.
It's not pity, it's called solidarity, but not something that Jordan Peterson would understand.
The cost of sterilizing children. You should think again. You're on the wrong side of this, and not in a trivial way.
I would appreciate if you don't ascribe beliefs to me that I don't have. Remember, my original question was about...
Well, you said earlier in this question that,
I said Elliot Page is an adult, and so do you think that he has the right to transition? That was the original question.
You made some comments after that. Yeah, but as a star and a public figure and a model for emulation, she also has the responsibility not to entice confused adolescents into a catastrophic decision before they have the maturity to make that decision.
I just have to say, Jordan, I think it's a little bit of a moral panic. I just don't see some sort of, frenzy of
what would you
wanting
consider
to become trans.
First of all, that's a hell of a way to put it.
Why
don't you take a look at the increase in surgical interventions and see what you think? I mean, how many do you think is too many?
Again,
if we're talking about
I'll answer your question. The argument is it used to be very repressed because that's very outside of the tradition and the norm and the standard, and that now we sort of let the boot off the neck a little bit.
What used to be suppressed?
The entire LGBTQ community. I mean, it was very recently we even got gay marriage in the United States.
First of all, they're not a community.
Well, you understand the point I'm making.
No, actually, neither I understand it nor you, and that's why we're delving into it. First of all, they're not a community. That's just a catchphrase. It's a buzzword.
And I'll tell
you something else, that almost all the kids who are undergoing surgical intervention, the clinical literature is absolutely clear on this. 80% of kids with gender dysphoria identify as homosexual when they mature.
Wrong. That is a 100% lie. Okay, he is lying about the statistics here. All right, let's just backtrack and get exactly what he said there, so we don't make any mistakes on interpreting his position here.
Who are undergoing surgical intervention. First of all, they're not a community. That's just a catchphrase. It's a buzzword. And I'll tell you something else, that almost all the kids who are undergoing surgical intervention, the clinical literature is absolutely clear on this. 80% of kids with gender dysphoria identify as homosexual when they mature.
Okay, so first of all, notice how he went from talking about surgical interventions within transgendered youths, okay? That's the premise he initially was talking about there. That's a conversation that they were having there, which initially branched off from Kyle Kalinsky's take on whether or not adult trans people should be able to have surgery and the freedom to go about identifying how they want to. And his response to that is to say that 80% of kids with gender dysphoria end up identifying as gay. Okay, completely disingenuous and also statistically wrong. So I'll tell you exactly why it's statistically wrong here. We have a breakdown here from the Human Rights Campaign on some of the relevant statistics. But here on detransitioning specifically, they say detransitioning is very rare. Medical regret is even rarer. According to the National Center for Transgender Equality 2015 U.S. Transgender Study survey, only 3% of respondents have detransitioned permanently at some point. The vast majority of respondents who detransition only do so temporarily. Detransitioning is often conflated with medical regret. However, detransitioning can include non-medical parts of someone's transition, such as changes in their gender expression or legal changes to their identity. One study found that less than 0.5% of trans patients who have received gonadectomy report surgical regret. Okay, less than 0.5%. And they say also, there is no scientific evidence showing that surgical regret would cause trans people to forego surgery in hindsight. Surgical regret could include trans patients who do not regret receiving surgery, but may be disappointed with one or more minor details relating to the outcome of their surgery. And trans people who also regret one or more parts of their surgery do not always detransition. When respondents detransition, it could include reasons beyond surgical regret. And according to the same survey by the same institution here, respondents who detransitioned cited a number of reasons for doing so, including facing too much harassment or discrimination after they began transitioning, which was 31%, cite facing too much harassment. Okay, the same exact thing that Jordan Peterson is contributing here. Having trouble getting a job or pressure from a parent, spouse, or other family members. So it seems like by far at least a plurality of even the tiny fraction who do end up detransitioning are because of societal pressures, which is the entire point that Kyle was trying to make at the beginning of this conversation. Okay, and also a lot of the studies that he's trying to cite here are talking about, I mean, it's incredibly dubious to say the least in terms of their methodology for a lot of these studies. Basically, I think the one that he's specifically citing here, he didn't give the actual citation, but the 80% figure is basically talking about people who at a very young age displayed any signs whatsoever that were outside of gender conformity according to their parents, okay? So this doesn't mean somebody at a young age identifying as someone of the opposite gender. It means somebody who displayed anything that could possibly be perceived as outside of gender norms. So it's a very different standard that you're talking about there. And we also got even more recent studies that have come out that show that over 90% of transgendered youths who socially transition, not getting surgery, but who socially transition, end up sticking with that transition 5 years down the line. So over 90%, this website is citing 3% of respondents have detransitioned permanently at some point. So, I mean, listen, and this is talking about, you know, after medical surgery interventions. So on both different fronts that he was talking about there, completely wildly inaccurate, statistically false, and disingenuous framing from Jordan Peterson here. The intellectual titan of the right doesn't even seem to understand some of the basics of this.
80%. And that means the vast majority of people who are being converted surgically are gay. Now, how is that an advantage to the gay community precisely?
No, see, I'm not taking a position in any way, shape, or form on the kids, because I don't know the first thing about this to comment on the kids. Well, but see, that's why we're having this conversation, though, is because my original question was about the adults and what your take is on the adults. And it sounds to me like, let me ask you a question, would you ban transition surgery for adults?
I don't know.
Really?
Yeah, really. We're paying a big price for it. And I think that it was an act of stunning hubris to conduct the first trans surgery procedure. And it's not obvious to me at all that it's been a net social good.
But aren't there some people that are obviously trans, who were born in one body, they feel like they're in the other body, and when they're an adult, they can make the decision? And then even from just a freedom and liberty perspective, shouldn't they have that right? Even if they do it and then they regret it, shouldn't they have the right to try it?
It's a good question. I mean, it's a tricky one, right? Because there's all sorts of surgical enhancement procedures that are it's not obviously appropriate to make them illegal. And I don't know exactly where the cutoff line is, so to speak, and that's partly why we're having a public discussion about it. But this entire argument, in many ways, is stated so idiotically that it almost defies description. I mean, what do you mean, feel like you're in the wrong body? What kind of measurement is that? No, hang on a sec. There are rules for these sorts of diagnostic decisions. Mm-hmm. Okay. The rule is that you have to make a valid and reliable diagnosis. That's if you're diagnosing depression or anxiety or obsessive compulsive disorder or cancer or anything like that. There are standards that you have to abide by in order to make a diagnosis, in order to fulfill the obligations of your professional college. If someone comes to you and says, I feel like I have lung cancer. That is not sufficient grounds upon which to formulate a diagnosis.
Okay, but we're not talking about something that is a inherent physical presence within your body. He's comparing having feelings of gender dysphoria, as he would call it, or somebody who is self-identifying as a member of the opposite gender and wants to, express themselves in that way. He's comparing that to cancer, okay? A literal physical thing that is taking over your body and eating it from the inside. That is very physically easy to identify as a medical professional, whereas being trans is something that is inherently, of course it has some inherently subjective component to that, but that's why you should, I don't know, maybe go talk to some trans people about what it means to them in their personal experience and going through decades in their lives in many circumstances where they feel as though they are not in the right body, where they feel as though they should be expressing their gender in a completely different way. So, I mean, talk to some fucking trans people about this instead of just hypothetically posing that this is some impossible to conceive concept that we're talking about here. Just completely fucking embarrassing.
It's much less proceed to surgery.
Mm-hmm.
And so the question is, what do you mean by feel? What is that? Is that an emotion? Is it a motivation? Is it a philosophical conclusion? What is it?
Let me explain to you what I mean. So I've been doing my show for about a decade, and about 2 or 3 years into doing my show, there were, some stories here and there that I covered about the trans issue. Somebody who is trans reached out to me and explained to me in a very straightforward way, yeah, look, I was born biologically female. I feel like I'm biologically male. My reality never lined up. Well, I'm just explaining what they said, and then you can respond however you'd like to respond. And they told me as soon as I got the surgery, changed the way I dressed, changed the way I appeared, I felt phenomenally better. And so that's why, at least for me, this was the answer. Now, I think it would be incredibly arrogant for me to say back to that person, no, you shouldn't do that, or I know better than you do for yourself. And that's not to say that every time somebody does this, it works out well, of course, because everybody's an individual. But in some instances, that's the answer. So, me as a simple outsider, I just look at it and say, hey, whatever floats your boat, and if it works, it works.
Look, most of the time, my attitude is you can go to hell in handbasket any way you choose if you're an adult. Now, this problem is complicated and compounded by the fact of the necessity of medical involvement and the ethics on the medical front. So when you asked me about how that should be regulated, my answer was I'm not exactly sure about that.
Yep,
although it isn't obvious to me that it's obvious to me.
So he's not exactly sure how it should be regulated, but he's going out there on Twitter and publicly calling the physician who conducted the transition surgery a criminal physician. So are you sure that you don't really have a strong position on this? Because that's kind of the entire reason why this discussion is happening in the first place, is because you did have a strong legal opinion on this. That's why you got fucking banned from Twitter in the first place. So listen, I mean, I'm just going to cut it off here because this is absolutely embarrassing and ridiculous, but credit to Kyle Kalinsky for, giving some degree of pushback on this. Obviously, in the moment, going up against somebody like Jordan Peterson, who is so obviously very angry and insecure as a person, going up against him and having to, in the moment, combat a lot of the, basically a tsunami, as Kyle characterized it to me, of rampant misinformation that's coming out every single second that he speaks. It can obviously be difficult to, break through all of the different nuanced things that he's saying in something like this. So it's easier for me after the fact to line some things up and have some, more cohesive responses to this. But nonetheless, in a clip like this, you actually get to see how completely absurd and ridiculous somebody like Jordan Peterson is. He doesn't even seem to have fully thought out, let alone gotten into the actual research on a lot of these different issues surrounding the trans community, not to mention the fact that it doesn't even seem like he's actually spoken to a member of the trans community to get a more firm understanding of what that feeling actually feels like. I mean, it's just completely ridiculous. It's like, I'm a straight cis man right now. That's how I identify. Obviously, I don't really have the ability to mentally envision what it would be like to be gay or trans, but that's why you listen to other people's experience in the same way that I don't understand what it's like to be black, but you can still go and listen to people who are black or whatever it may be and get a more firm understanding of their perspective, their history, their experience through life, and how that has affected them. So, I mean, at the end of the day, this is just one clip from this extensive interview that was done. So again, I'm probably going to dive into a bunch of different other ones, but if this is the guy that the right is trying to prop up as some sort of an intellectual giant, I mean, that is a complete and utter fucking embarrassment.